Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Strategic Co-Sourcing of Internal Audits in Higher Education. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Tammy Lohr, Director, and Chelsea Ritchie, Director. With that, I'll turn it over to Tammy to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Kiva. Thank you all for joining this morning. As Kiva mentioned, I'm Tammy Lohr. I'm a director in our business consulting services group, and our group specifically specializes in providing internal and performance audit services, as well as some specific management consulting around grants and efficiency and effectiveness for the public sector in particular. And that, of course, includes higher education institutions. I've been doing this work for about a decade now, and we're really excited to talk today about how we help clients through internal audits to create impact at their institutions. And I'll let Chelsea also introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Tammy. So nice to be here today with everybody. I am Chelsea Ritchie. I am also a director within our group. I specialize in internal audits, specifically looking at internal controls as well as segregation of duties. Some other key services I helped offer in our group is policy and procedure work, really laying out that foundation for solid segregation of duties, internal controls, and whatnot. And, I didn't think it would, I thought I had to point out that my shirt today has my alma mater, University of New Mexico. I thought that was important, especially when we're talking to a group as higher education. So really happy that you all are here today. Want to kind of go over what are we going to be talking about today. So here is our agenda. First off, we're just going to go and talk about the fundamentals. What is internal audit? Then we're going to go into internal audit structures. There's a couple that we really want to illustrate today. We'll give you some examples that both Tammy and I have seen throughout our careers. We'll talk about internal audit sourcing. And then we'll end with the value of co-sourced audits, driving that back home. And hopefully, if we have any time, we will get to questions and answers. But of course, if we don't have time, please still write those questions and we will get back to you with answers. We will email you after the session. So we're going to go to our first polling question. My institution has an internal audit function. True, false, or I'm not sure. Please make sure to answer all questions, especially if you are looking for that CPE credit.
I'll be curious to see the distribution of these responses with the audience that we have today, since we know that not every institution has an internal audit function, especially those smaller private institutions may not have dedicated internal audit. So we're excited to see what we have with us today and sort of how much detail we want to go into just what is internal audit for those of you that might not have this function.
We're hovering around 88%. There's around 20 more of you. Please make sure you fill out that question, get your CPE credits. All right, Tammy, what do you think? Should we move on?
Let's do it.
Okie dokie. All right, so this is good news. 66% of you say that true, you do have an internal audit function, so really excited to get to know those folks. But you know, there's a good over 30% that either don't have it or you're not sure. So let's talk about some options for you all. All right. So first and foremost, I think it's really important to go back to the basic blocks here of what is internal audit. Really, internal audit is an independent, objective, both assurance and consulting activity, really designed to add value as well as improve an organization's operations. You know, at the fundamental value, internal audit helps organizations accomplish their objectives by systematically evaluating and improving the effectiveness of many different areas, such as risk management, control, governance processes. You know, and I think it's important to remember that the purpose of internal audit is it provides insights as well as hopefully really meaningful recommendations, both to management of other key stakeholders, such as like the board of directors, to make sure that, you know, there's a continued enhancement of the organization's overall performance. And, you know, when we're thinking about internal audit, there's some real key features to remember. You know, one is that internal audits really should be providing objective evaluations of those different areas, you know, such as risk management, internal controls, and they really help provide assurance for stakeholders about the reliability of things such as, you know, the financial reporting, compliance, the effectiveness of those operations. Another really key thing that I think that I love about internal audit is that continuous improvement. So internal audit functions really contribute to continuous improvement by identifying areas for enhancement, as well as providing those recommendations for better practices within your organization. And it's so important because, you know, organizations, if we like it or not, are always going to be adapting to changing environments, improving their operations, hopefully, as well as coming with, you know, huge milestones. And one that I feel like Tammy and I will always bring up is, you know, with a pandemic that we just finished, and what were those changes? And that is a huge one where internal audit can really come home and bring some valuable recommendations to organizations. And then the last thing that, you know, I wanted to harp on when thinking about internal audit is that overall compliance aspect. Internal auditors really help to assess making sure that you are in compliance with applicable laws, those regulations, which are ever changing in our industry, as well as internal policies, making sure, do you have sound internal policies Are you doing best practices around there? Are there huge gaps in segregation of duties, internal controls? And I think through those compliance aspects, if you have an internal audit function, this really helps avoid, potential legal or regulatory issues that might come, and helps you really establish an adherence to your internal guidelines. So going on, there's three. I love internal audit because you will always see that internal audit is constantly going back and forth with accountability and reporting to the different stakeholders, which would be usually your management and your governing body, as well as taking those directions and the oversight. So this is a great illustration, and Tammy and I use this a lot when presenting the value of internal audit. Internal audit is a constant communication ring between these different stakeholders. What it really, this illustration helps to show is that, they are the middleman working independently from management, but also reporting to that governing body, which is a really important aspect of internal audit because they are separate from, your regular management. So they don't have, they have that objective oversight to really, not have a particular opinion on something. And I think it's also important to remember that the best way of internal audit, if it's going to be co-sourced, fully outsourced, or if you have an internal function within your higher education system, is that communication is constantly going. And we'll talk about this later, but what you want to make sure is that these three bodies are constantly talking with one another, communicating with one another. There's no surprises, nothing like that. The other really important thing to remember, especially when looking at this illustration, on the far right side, that is where we talk about the external assurance providers. So that really would be your financial audit. And sometimes because we have the financial audit and internal audit, the audit word will get people tripped up. And so we're going to talk about those differences. But I wanted to point that out in this illustration, that you can see that internal audit really is a function within the system, and our external audit or our financial audit is going to be really, is not going to be in the mix of these different bodies. So it's an important thing to remember. So going with that, why would we do internal audit? And I guess a more important question is, why wouldn't you do internal audit? It's such a really great aspect to have in your organization. But a couple of things that to think about when thinking is if internal audit is right for your, education system, or how you're going to go about that, if it's going to be internally or fully, outsourced, or maybe a combination of both in that co-sourcing, is it really does help enhance governance. Internal audit strengthens governance by providing an independent assessment, and it both highlights aspects that are important for the board or the oversight to see, as well as management. And communication will be different for both of those aspects when thinking about what we're providing to both the board as well as management. But it's a really great tool to use. It also helps improve risk management. When you have an internal audit function, you are identifying and constantly assessing those risks that might hold true to your higher education. I think it's important, especially when thinking about co-sourcing, when you have different individuals thinking about what might be risky to your organization. That is so important, because what management might think is risky could be have a completely different different take than what internal audit thinks. And they're both equally important, but having those different aspects are really vital to make sure that you are appropriately assessing your risk management. It also increases operational efficiency. And, I think one of the best pieces I always call to my clients, my gift to you at the end, is that we are going to be providing you with meaningful recommendations. If you have a strong internal audit function, this really helps make sure that, somebody with outside oversight is identifying potential inefficiencies within your processes, as well as providing you those meaningful recommendations to really drive home processes and make your systems well aligned and, really flow correctly. And then the last piece that I always like to illustrate when thinking about why internal audit is that it really helps provide stakeholder confidence. I can't tell you how many times, you see your oversight of a board when you say you have internal auditors. If you have these experts that are coming in and providing a different take at your operational risk, as well as your, policies and procedures. And I think it just provides that oversight that really helps, alleviate some, some worries that potential board members might feel, that there is some oversight and that, as a system, as a whole, you really are taking this seriously. You want to drive home best practices, and so on and so forth. Lastly here, before I hand it on over to Tammy, is I did want to illustrate again the differences between internal audit and external audit. I think a lot of times we'll come into an organization and people don't hear the internal and external part. They only hear the audit part, and that makes them just freeze in anxiety. But they are very different aspects. And I think, we kind of talk about the main changes and what the differences are. But I will highlight a couple things. The role I think is really important. So with internal audit, we are looking at operational efficiency. We're looking at performance enhancement, as well as that risk management. And who do we report to? We report to leadership, making sure that they agree with recommendations. They think that this is something doable, really driving home those internal processes and controls. When looking at external audit, what are they doing? They are verifying our accuracy and the integrity of our financial statements. So completely different things. Internal audit is looking at the processes, and sometimes the processes around financial statements, around how we come up with our financial statements. But external audit is really going to be driving home, are our numbers accurate? Are they reliable? That sort of thing. And when does this happen? So a good internal audit system will be happening year round. This will be on a continuous basis. You will be having projects in different aspects of the entire higher education system, not just the finance department. Where really your external audit, this is typically going to be at year end. And they're going to be really driving home the finance department, grant, if you have different aspects of your grants, as well as, purchasing, that sort of thing. So, internal audit is going to be looking more holistically everywhere, where your external audit is going to be honing in on particular aspects of, your higher education system. Last but not least, I think it's really important to talk about standards. So standards typically within internal audit, those are done by the Institute of Internal Audit Standards. Consulting standards are another big one. But really your external audit, they are focusing on those generally accepted accounting principles. If you have major grants, major, government subsidies, that sort of thing, looking at the government standards as well, and also applicable regulatory guidelines that might hold true to your system. I think it's really important to also think about that your external audit has to be done, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, by an independent third-party CPA. But the good thing about internal audit is you can have internal employees as well as contractors outside of, an external CPA firm that are really, helping you perform this work. So a couple of differences to remember, and hopefully you can explain to others when you hear the word internal audit versus that external audit factor. All right, Tammy, take it away.
Okay. Great. And one other thing that I just wanted to say on this slide that we didn't have on here is the definition of a finding is also a little bit different. So in an internal audit, you will have findings, and that is normal. So findings indicate an opportunity for improvement rather than a material weakness. And so it's not the end of the world if you have a finding under internal audit, whereas for an external audit, it sort of has a different connotation to have a finding. So that's another sort of key difference that we end up working between as we're doing this work. But anyways, I want to move on to talk a little bit about higher education and specifically look at some of the risks in higher education right now. I am positive that I am just preaching to the choir here, given the audience today, but I wanted to just cover quickly some of these because we've been doing work with clients really in each of these different areas in our role as either a fully outsourced or a co-sourced internal auditor for some higher education institutions. So as we are sort of working through developing a risk-based audit plan, these are some of the sort of topics that are really coming up. The first is, of course, declining enrollment. So we have both demographic shifts as well as individuals who are really starting to question the value of higher education. And both of those are sort of coalescing to result in this decline in overall enrollment, as well as challenges in maintaining your enrollment numbers. So here, institutions are facing a lot of pressure to attract and retain students. The pool of students that they're able to do that with is also shrinking. But this is really important because so many institutions are reliant on their tuition revenue as the financial foundation for their operations. And that then sort of leads into the next area of those operational pressures where you are facing financial strain, many of you, because your operating costs are increasing. You are not insulated from inflation, but at the same time, you have that declining enrollment. So a lot of institutions are really rethinking what are their budgeting practices, how are they doing resourcing, where are they able to reduce resources, and that might mean program reductions or staff reductions have to take place in order to ensure your financial stability going into the future. Of course, cybersecurity and technological competence are always going to be a risk in our industry. So cybersecurity has been, and of course continues to be, that high risk area for higher education in particular. Ransomware and data breaches are really areas of the highest concern in this area since colleges and universities have a lot of sensitive data. They also have a lot of users in their systems. And so they just have this necessity for additional security measures to help protect your systems and information. There have been, of course, some very high-profile cybersecurity incidents in the industry, so this risk just sort of continues to persist. But at the same time, with those operational pressures, you may have pressure to reduce the resources dedicated to cybersecurity or be looking at outsourcing those as well. The next area is student mental health. So as Chelsea talked about earlier, coming out of that pandemic, mental health issues are certainly top front and center for many students and colleges, again, strapped for resources. You may not have had the most robust student affairs center before, but now that you have declining resources, the ability to provide those services is also declining and often not keeping up with the demand that your students have today, since that is increasing. Talent management has been another key issue. So institutions are having a much harder time being able to attract and retain qualified staff. There's a lot of competition from other sectors. There's pretty high workloads in higher education. There can be lower compensation, and then that just impacts the quality and the stability of both faculty and staff. Regulatory and legal compliance. Chelsea had talked a little bit about this area. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of change going on. The DOE seems to be constantly putting out new information that seems to be moving the target all the time. So how are we keeping up with those areas and those risks? So we have Title IX listed here. That can also include, student safety, accessibility, privacy, GLBA, those types of things. And so just thinking through just that compliance framework that you all have, how are we structuring that? How are we resourcing it? What are we doing to make sure that we can keep up with those different changes? And the last area is facilities and deferred maintenance. So many institutions have aging infrastructure. There's a high cost of maintaining your buildings and facilities, as well as providing the necessary upgrades for them. And that deferred maintenance does create both safety risks as well as sort of a reputational risk if you have facilities that aren't necessarily keeping up with the cost of tuition in terms of what the student expects to see on campus. So I'm sure that these are all familiar to all of you, but wanted to just quickly cover some of these risk areas, since these are the types of things that internal audit should really be able to help you assess and identify opportunities for improvement in. So in internal audit, as Chelsea has noted, we try to assess essentially the risk that your institution will not be able to achieve your goals and objectives. So these are the different areas that we are thinking about. We're looking at all these different components from internal controls. So what are your internal control environment, processes, segregation of duties, Chelsea's favorite topic, policies and procedures, approvals, asset management, all those sort of key components to reduce the risk of fraud as well. We think about performance. So how are we performing relative to our peers? How are we performing relative to our goals and objectives? Are we being able to sort of achieve what we intended? We're thinking about the capital program that you might have to be able to assess your facilities and deferred maintenance. Space planning has been a big concern for many institutions. So being able to sort of look at how are we putting together those capital programs? How are we funding them? How are we prioritizing things there? Grants and contracts, that certainly increased during the pandemic, but continues to be a higher level of potential risk or concern. Both if we are receiving grants, how are we making sure that we set up our processes and our resources to ensure grant compliance? And also if we're administering contracts, what are the processes that we have in place to make sure our vendors are complying with those contract terms and agreements? We're often finding contract audits are a great tool to be able to take a look at those and potentially recover some costs. And then, of course, technology. So thinking about things like system access, data governance, disaster recovery, cybersecurity, all those different components. So again, we're looking at all these different things in internal audit, which is another area that makes it a little bit unique from external audit. So with that, we have our next polling question. So we want to hear from you whether your institution's internal audit function is impactful to help you reduce risks, promote compliance, and enhance operations. So you could say completely, they're wonderful. Maybe you are the internal auditor, and so please select A. Maybe it's B, and it's most of the time, and you're saying we've got a couple really great projects that have helped us out, but we've got some other projects that were maybe a little bit less value add. We've got about half the time, we've got not really, or we don't have an internal audit function. So if you don't know if you have an internal audit function, you're probably going to want to select E. If you don't know if you have it, you probably don't know the impact that function is having on your institution. Okay, great. All right, I am going to move us forward. We've got over 90% of you who've responded. last 2 seconds. Okay. All right, we've got 30% saying completely. Internal audit is very impactful, 35% most of the time. Good, good. And then a smattering of folks sort of about half the time or not really. So that is great feedback. Thank you. Okay. So we're going to talk through the different internal audit structure options from a fully insourced internal audit function all the way to a fully outsourced internal audit function, and all of the sort of variations in between. So looking at subject matter co-sourcing, staff augmentation co-sourcing, or integrated co-sourcing. And so we are going to talk about this. But before we do, we're going to give you another polling question. So we want to know what your internal audit function looks like today. So is it A, all done in-house? Is it B, mostly done in-house, although some projects might be outsourced? Is it C, fully outsourced? Or D, your internal audit function does not exist? So make sure you fill out that polling question. And just a reminder that you can put questions in the Q&A, and Chelsea and I will do our best to try to answer some of those at the end of the session. If we don't have time to do that, we'll be able to follow up with you via email after the fact. Okay. I'll be curious to see how many of our clients that we work on internal audit with might be here and putting in B or C as well.
I'll be really upset if they say it doesn't exist. Too bad.
We'll have to follow up with them.
Follow up with them on that.
Okay, I'm going to move us forward. So we have about 36% is all done in-house, 31% all done in-house with some projects outsourced, fully outsourced, or about 24% of you where it doesn't exist. So great. We're going to talk through all these different options, the pros, the cons, and the different success factors for each of these different sourcing models, because that exists for all of them. So let's start out by talking about a fully insourced internal audit function. This is where all of your internal audits activities are managed and executed by people within your institution, actual employees of your institution. So some of the benefits of this model is that there's really deep organizational knowledge. These internal auditors are also part of the institution, so they have a very deep, sometimes personal understanding of the culture, processes, the systems, and sort of the changes that are going on, which means that they are sort of living in the risks alongside their colleagues, and they're often very well positioned to identify those potential risk areas and develop an audit plan to be able to address them. This model also tends to result in a lot of consistency and continuity. That internal audit team hopefully isn't always sort of shifting with new people, and they will have consistent processes that would be followed for each of their different projects and engagements. And then finally, the institution ultimately has control of that audit function, including the ability to quickly reprioritize activities in response to new and emerging risks. So all good things, certainly a lot of benefits to having an insourced internal audit function. On the flip side, some of the drawbacks are that you only have one internal audit team, right? So you have to be able to build and maintain that team. That requires investment in hiring and training and retaining staff. You also have so many work hours available to do all of the different projects that you might see as a priority. So it can be a little bit more challenging to scale audit activities up quickly if there's an urgent need that comes up, or sort of be able to address new or more complex items in a sort of timely fashion. Because your internal auditors are employees, they also have the potential, not necessarily, but the potential to have some close relationships with others in the institution. You really don't want to have there be any sort of politics getting in the way of in-sourced internal audit. But just by nature of them being an employee, there are different sort of levers that are being pulled on those folks as well. And because you only have so many internal auditors, you also only have the expertise that those internal auditors bring or that you can train them in. So if you have niche areas like cybersecurity that you're really interested in, then you may not be able to provide as robust internal audits as you may wish to in those very niche areas. But what makes in-sourced internal audit shops really successful are some of the things that are listed here. So having a really strong leadership and stakeholder relationship is absolutely key. That's sort of common throughout, I would say, all of these different sourcing models. If that relationship isn't there, then you can be seen as that thing that sometimes sort of comes in and bugs people and then writes a report about everything that they did wrong. And, you know, no one wants that. Internal audit also doesn't want to be perceived in that way. But that could be the risk if you don't have those really strong relationships and that really good understanding about the purpose and the role of internal audit that we reviewed earlier. It's also very important to have really clear independence so that reporting structure is clear. You're reporting to the audit committee. And then finally, you want to make sure that your internal audit shop is doing those regular quality assessments through your internal and peer reviews. And that helps make sure that you can be really effective, compliant with audit standards, and then aligned with best practices. And then the next structural option that we have here is the subject matter co-sourced audit. So in this situation, an institution essentially contracts out a specific engagement to a vendor with expertise in subject matter areas that require specialized knowledge. These are pretty common for things like technology-related audits, some regulatory functions, and other areas where you really just want some best practices brought in to be able to help create change. So what's nice about this model is that it allows your institution to bring in those external specialists that have a very deep knowledge about a specific subject area, and that enhances the overall quality of the audit and the results, as well as the recommendations and the resources that could be provided to be able to help your institution implement those recommendations. Sometimes your external provider could also provide things like training or insights into that functional team or even the internal audit team, which helps upskill everyone across the institution and really improve their capabilities over time. And because only this one engagement was outsourced, you keep that institutional knowledge and just augment with this very specific expertise. What can be a little bit challenging about a subject matter co-sourced audit is that it just creates another party to work with on an audit. And that in and of itself can just create some challenges in communication, that coordination, risk assessment, making sure that we're focusing on the areas that are really top priority for the institution. Those can very certainly be overcome, but it is a risk since you have to do a lot more of that coordination, be very thoughtful about who's in the loop at what point, and that external provider may not always be following the exact process that your team is used to seeing from you. So it just takes a little bit more of that education to make sure everyone's lined up on approach. Depending on the specialized knowledge that's required for the subject matter audit, you could also have different costs associated with this, especially if you end up uncovering more issues that require longer term work. And of course, data security is an overall risk, and that is a risk that pertains to audit providers. So I know that when we're doing this type of work, we are very thoughtful about what information we're requesting, in what way, how is it being stored, how is it being used, because it can be a risk to give out that sensitive information to another party. So to be successful with a subject matter expert, you should just make sure there are very clear roles and responsibilities, very clear expectations for communication, and also an integrated risk assessment to make sure, again, that the provider is able to cover all the areas that you are interested in. So one area that I wanted to be able to talk about for a subject matter co-sourced audit is doing some co-sourced or some subject matter co-sourcing for data analytics. So if you are an institution that is interested in data analytics, but maybe doesn't know where to get started, integrating this through something like a subject matter co-source can be a great opportunity. So institutions are using historical data, trends and patterns to be able to help identify their high risk areas. And so here you see just a few of these different data analytics tools that can be used in internal audit. So using descriptive analysis to look at historical data, look at those trends, see what patterns may be signaling internal control weaknesses or potential areas of risk. You could use diagnostic analytics. So in that case, you're not only identifying the issues as you are in descriptive analytics, but also trying to understand the root cause of those items. You can look at predictive analytics where you're forecasting potential future scenarios like projected revenue shortfalls or increases in fraud risk, and then use that information to develop an internal audit program to help address those risks before they really surface. And then, of course, real-time analytics are very helpful for internal audit. So that's where you're monitoring transactions continuously rather than just relying on periodic audits to look at individual items. So in those real-time analytics, you can more quickly detect and respond to those risks. And this type of analysis can help flag those unusual patterns or anomalies really instantaneously for potential investigation or just an additional review to make sure everything's checking out. So when institutions are interested in pursuing data analytics, we'll also be able to help them sort of have that service provided to them through this subject matter co-sourcing. I'll have Chelsea talk about staff augmentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Tammy. So when we think about staff augmentation co-sourcing, really this is when we are involving the external resources. So, a third party such as, Moss Adams or someone like that to come in to help supplement your internal audit function currently within your institution. And, usually you'll see a lot of staff augmentation audits, particularly when there's a high demand. There's a lot of audits going on in a certain amount of period of time. If there's certain skills that your internal audit team might not have, if it's really particular to IT, we see that a lot. Or, when we do need to bring in high volumes of data analytics into a particular internal audit. And really, there's a lot of different advantages that, you can take, but, we will talk about some cons as well. So, in particular, I think thinking about the capacity and flexibility that co-sourcing really will help bring during these types of audits. You can go quickly scale up in a matter of, a couple of days, which is really huge. So like I said, again, if you have a lot of, high audits that you are trying to get through in a particular amount of time, if there's a special project or if there's really some, unemerged risks that you didn't think were going to happen, but you need that expertise, that really an internal audit team, externally from your own can bring those specialized skills. So, specialized skills and expertise, when you think about, a big third party, they're going to have the special skills and expertise in many different areas. And like Tammy had mentioned, this is, one of the main pros that we will always be driving home in this area, because one internal audit team or little departments, or sometimes they're a one-man shop, they're not going to have all the different skills really that they can diversify and really make sure that you're hitting different aspects throughout your institution. Another thing that's really great about these staff augmentation is that knowledge transfer and training. Having, kind of having a third party come in and show different ways of doing things. Those data analytics, I know as a third party that we are, though that is something that we really pride ourselves in, and it can provide high value and fast results. And thinking about those aspects, maybe that's something that could be brought home internally to your internal audit team. And then last but not least is I think it's really important to remember that they bring in an enhanced independence. So especially in some particular sticky areas, high risk areas, they bring that additional layer of objectivity and independence that you might be needing. And so that's another really good thing to think about when thinking about these staff augmentations. Obviously, with everything, there are some cons to think about when thinking about this type of internal audit. So number one is just the interactions between the third party and within your internal audit team. There might be differences in organizational culture, work styles, audit methodologies, and sometimes I've seen the two butt heads about which one's right or which way the audit is going to go for that methodology. Another really hard thing to think about is management coordination. So who is going to be coordinating with management? Is there going to be any inefficiencies that management sees that they're kind of bugged about? Who's going to be reporting the results at the end? That sort of thing. Just once again, I think these can always be mitigated through clear communication, but they're things that we want to remember about. Another one that we see a lot of times could be potential security concerns. I will say that, at Moss Adams, we pride ourselves in having, secure portals whenever we're carrying any kind of different data, that sort of thing. But, there is a risk of sensitive information being exposed, particularly when it comes to payroll, anyone's, any information with employees. And so that can, raise overall concerns about, security and confidentiality, as well as just the inconsistency of the quality of work. So, there might be a certain way and reporting style that the internal audit team, within your institution is used to reporting things to. There might be a certain tactic in the way that you present to your board that if you have an external party or you're working together on something, that they might not see eye to eye, or there might not be that smooth transition. I think once again, when we're thinking about these different areas, these can be mitigated through that communication and setting the expectations and outcomes, right at the beginning of the project to make sure that, really the project goes seamlessly. There are a couple of success factors that I think that both, when Tammy and I were thinking about this type of internal audit that we have seen. And so, like I said, having that clear scope and expectation, we always suggest having a kickoff party, or a kickoff meeting right away, right when the agreement has been signed. Both stakeholders come to an agreement about those different work roles and responsibilities, so on and so forth. And then really making sure that you have that continuous evaluation and feedback for one another throughout the project is so important. Making sure that there's that constant communication. So one thing I wanted to point out on this one, we have done many staff augmented internal audits, but one that I thought worked particularly well was over a payroll internal audit. So once again, that sticky situation, so they wanted to have some third a third party kind of have some extra set of eyes, as well as there was a ton of data that needed to be presented. So we were able to bring in our data analytic tools to come help bring home those fast results quickly. And then I think what's really important is that we were able to provide some meaningful findings that, quickly, that the university might not have been able to have done in a quick fashion, especially around payroll. Everyone wants to get paid and they want it to be accurate. So very, very important, as well as, providing them those meaningful recommendations and outcomes. So we provided them, some ideas around some formal processes around areas surrounding their findings. And then I wanted to talk really quick, very similar to what we see with the staff augmentation, but having just an integrated co-sourcing of, internal audit functions. So this is really when there is that close partnership between an organization's, the institution's internal audit team, as well as that external audit service provider. Really, really important. You're going to see that there's same pros and cons. Overall, you want to make sure that there is a really strong governance structure as well as communication, around the two different parties. More success in this area. I know, thinking about the success rates in these areas, we will have bi-weekly meetings with that internal audit team, just to make sure that we're both meeting expectations, we're getting all the information we need to complete our projects, and they're helping us out any way that we were expecting them to. As really also making sure that there's that quality assurance. So really similarly to that staff augmentation, you want to make sure that reporting techniques, what is being conveyed to the board, so on and so forth, is set and clear for both parties, really making sure that that alignment and planning is done in the front end of things will really bring home that success. And so another one that I wanted to point out that we've done recently was over some a university's auxiliary funds. And this was really important. I guess we should point out that it was a division. So there was multiple universities within the division. And that was important because we were able to rely on the internal audit team that they internally have to look at a whole nother university. This was a really close timeline, a really close, tight project timeline that needed to be completed for this. And so I feel like both parties felt like invaluable to have each other help with getting the internal audit done, timely. So, a really another great example, when we were able to come up with solutions together, and we worked with the internal audit team to come up with feasible things and outcomes that would really make sense for the division as a whole, because the internal audit team understood the different dynamics that were happening between the different universities. And so really working hand in hand was invaluable to really make sure that this internal audit was successful. Last but not least, before I hand it over to Tammy, I did want to say, talk about administering a fraud, waste, and abuse program, and then also an ethics hotline. This is something that we do quite regularly with our co-sourcing of internal audits, as well as our fully outsourced system as well. But this is a really nice way, we can help develop the program, train at different levels that really, maybe an internal audit team would not be able to do. There's also some pros to this. There's that confidentiality protection, protection from retaliation. Sometimes those are things that really create weariness around a fraud, waste, and abuse program and an ethics hotline. So just wanted to bring home those areas and thoughts, about other potential areas of how a co-sourcing or external audit might work. All right, Tammy.
Great. So the last area that we wanted to cover with you all today is just the fully outsourced model. So similar to the co-source models that you've heard about, in this model, you'll have access to specialized expertise in areas like compliance, cybersecurity, regulations, and others. This can be really valuable in a very complex regulated environment like higher education, where specific knowledge of policies, grants, financial aid, and regulatory requirements is really necessary. By fully outsourcing the function, it also reduces the risk of internal biases by providing that really fresh and independent perspective on institutional processes. Those providers often are working with other institutions and can sort of draw on that experience and bring that to you in terms of your recommendations. And it can also reduce the total cost of internal audit, because all the costs associated with recruiting, hiring, retention, training are really borne by the firm rather than your institution per se. And then these services can also be scalable, so you're only paying for what you need. And then finally, these audit firms like Moss Adams often have access to that advanced audit technology and tools such as data analytics software that may not be available in-house or feasible for an internal shop to be able to implement. However, like any model, there are certainly drawbacks to fully outsourced functions. So you can have the potential loss of that institutional knowledge. Your external internal auditors won't have as deep an understanding of your culture, your unique challenges, your historical context. There will need to be some relationships there to be able to help with that. And then you're also totally reliant on an external provider for all aspects of your internal audit function. And that can create challenges if your provider is underperforming or has time periods where they aren't available. So if you have a firm where they're really moonlighting as internal auditors, but they are usually external auditors, you might encounter that. That's not the situation with our team, but that is something we've seen in the market. And then you still also will need someone in-house to be able to help manage and oversee that external team. So we like to always make sure that that's very clear. What makes this model successful, some of the lessons learned that we have is, like Chelsea talked about, a very clear contractual agreement that outlines those roles, responsibilities, and expectations, really clear reporting protocols, cost structures, communication, and making sure that there's really good alignment with your priorities as the institution and what is really being enacted within internal audit, and those dedicated liaisons to help facilitate that communication and provide that context. Then finally, just making sure that there are processes for monitoring performance, such as audit completeness and timing, as well as gathering feedback from stakeholders and those who sit on your audit committee. So with that, I want to have us do our last polling question of the day before we close out. We want to hear from you after this presentation. If your institution is interested in insourcing internal audit, co-sourcing internal audit, or outsourcing internal audit, that first option has a typo, so it should be insourcing rather than intersourcing. But let us know what you think. We hope that you found this information to be very helpful. I saw one question in the chat that I wanted to just quickly address. So can you provide an example of how internal audit can affect declining enrollment? And that is typically done through an enrollment management operational review. So we've done several of those to look at how institutions are attracting, targeting, marketing, and really reducing student melt. So really thinking through the front end of the process and also thinking through retention practices. A lot of our clients have found that, you know, if they were able to just retain students from year 1 to year 2, that they may not have as dire a financial situation. So that's just one example there, and I'm happy to follow up with additional information. But with that, I am going to turn this over to Kiva to help close us out.
Thank you so much, Tim and Chelsea, for today. If we didn't have time to answer your question, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the webcast, but please feel free to reach out to either of our presenters today if you have additional. For those of you who would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download it from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. We'll also be sending a copy of the slides via email following. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download in the CPE progress window. A minute to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will also be emailed to you within the next 3 weeks, should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here's a link to the survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated. Again, thank you for joining us and take care, everyone.